Hi, my name is Bethany Cassidy, and I wanted to show you how you could consider using Hinge questions in your unit planning so that you could think about how you could assess and probe student thinking. All right, so this example is for fourth grade. And when you go into the ARC, I'm sure that the layout's going to look very similar next year, but you'll find those really helpful planning documents, the vertical alignment master list, and then you have your priority standards master list, and you have your at a glance document. Then, of course, you have all of your differentiation, and then you've got your unit plans underneath. So I would suggest to consider starting with the priority standards. And that can be helpful because as you backwards plan and think about those priority standards, that can give you just a hyper focus and what learning that you want to teach and assess for your students. Of course, you're doing all of the teaching for all of the TEKs for that unit, but again, it just gives you a little bit of a hyper focus to think of and at least a place to start. So this particular example can show 4.2b, which is representing the value of the digit in whole numbers through a billion and decimals to the hundredths using expanded notation and numerals. All right, so that gives us kind of an idea. Next, let's go into the unit plan and see where we might find that particular TEK. And just a quick search, I found that it came up several times because it's a priority TEK and lots of different lessons that address that TEK. So you could decide where you want to assess, and of course, any place is the better choice depending on what you want to, when you want to assess it. But I would consider doing it after a few days of exploring with that TEK to give students more time to develop that learning. So let's kind of think about using it perhaps maybe at this lesson. What is it between? And I'm going to pop open that lesson. Let me scooch to the top. Okay. So this is a lesson where they're using Desmos, and that's a great teaching tool and a great interactive tool for students. And what also is wonderful is it has these classroom conversation tools. And so you'll have all of these different questions that can come up and really spark some conversation and deeper thinking. So lots of different ways you could do it. Here's one way that you might consider using a Hinge question. You could look down to those discussion slides, and this particular question, for example, maybe I want to assess it in the middle of a lesson rather than the end. And it could look something like, which is it closer to, 700,000 or 800,000? And then probing some more thinking, how do you know? So that can give me a little bit of a better glimpse into how students are engaging with that TEK. And it's also nice because the lesson even provides that answer right here to anticipate how they might be thinking too. So again, this is a Hinge point that you could consider doing in the middle of the lesson. The next step to think about is, do I want to ask this as a whole group or do I want to ask this in small groups? Either way is fine, depending on what you are looking for your students. If you chose to do it in a whole group, it's pretty easy to kind of roll that out. If you chose to do it as a smaller group, one way you might want to think about doing that, since it comes in the middle of the lesson, is to have the students engage in that in small groups, table groups, partner talk, and the teacher can be monitoring and observing and listening in for the student discussion. Maybe they're interacting on their whiteboards. Maybe they are using some other instructional support so that they can better explain that to their partner or partners. But that could give you some valuable information for a few students or more than a few students so that you can anticipate and plan for the next day or after. So that's one way you could do it in the middle of a lesson. Another lesson that follows a few days later is called Guess and Zoom. Sorry, let me scooch to the top again. And so this is working with some mystery numbers. Again, this just happens to be a Desmos lesson. And it's a great instructional tool because it has a way for you to interact with visuals and specifically number lines, and that's really helpful for kids. So there's a classroom conversation tools again. But in this lesson, there's a Hinge question that can come at the end, and it's a kind of a way to check that understanding and to close out the lesson. And that question could be, what advice would you give a student who is trying to name a point on a number line, especially when the point is located at a big number? So lots of different ways you could do this. You could have students turn and talk again with a partner. You could have students do it in table groups. You could have students even maybe write it out on a sticky note or on their whiteboards and hold up what their answer would be, and provide some talking stems or some sentence frames that might help them as they're thinking through that. But that data right there could really help to drive where do you need to focus for the next day or the following day so that they can address that priority TEAC. All right, so that's just a few ways that you might consider doing it in this for fourth grade as you are looking to plan your instruction. All right, thank you for listening. I hope that was helpful.